Dr. Elena Rodriguez had encountered many supposedly haunted locations during her 15-year career as a paranormal investigator, but nothing had prepared her for the Whitmore Mansion in Savannah, Georgia. Standing before the imposing antebellum structure on a humid October evening in 2023, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the building. The mansion, built in 1847 by tobacco magnate Jeremiah Whitmore, had been abandoned for over 30 years. Local real estate agents refused to show the property, construction workers wouldn't set foot on the grounds, and even the most skeptical residents of Savannah's historic district crossed the street rather than walk past its wrought iron gates. The reason, according to local legend, was simple. The mansion was home to the restless spirits of over 150 enslaved people who had died on the property during its operation as a plantation. Dr. Rodriguez had been contacted by the mansion's current owner, Margaret Whitmore Chen, a descendant of the original family who lived in California and had inherited the property from a distant relative. Margaret had never visited Savannah, but was desperate to sell the mansion, which had been on the market for decades without a single serious offer. "I've tried everything," Margaret had explained during their initial phone conversation. "I've hired historians, structural engineers, even other paranormal investigators. Everyone tells me the same thing. There's something in that house that doesn't want to be disturbed. I need to know what happened there so I can finally put it to rest." Dr. Rodriguez's research into the Whitmore family history had revealed a pattern of tragedy and violence that extended far beyond the typical brutalities of the antebellum plantation system. Jeremiah Whitmore had been known throughout Georgia as one of the most cruel and innovative plantation owners of his era, a man who treated the development of new torture techniques as a hobby and the breaking of human spirits as an art form. The historical records Dr. Rodriguez had uncovered painted a picture of systematic brutality that was shocking, even by the standards of the 1800s. Whitmore had purchased the land in 1845 and immediately began construction of what he envisioned as the most productive tobacco plantation in Georgia. But productivity for Whitmore was not just about agricultural output. It was about the complete domination and control of every person under his authority. Contemporary accounts from neighboring plantation owners found in the Georgia Historical Society archives described Whitmore's methods with a mixture of admiration and horror. A letter from plantation owner Samuel Morrison to his brother in Virginia, dated 1849, provided disturbing insight into Whitmore's reputation. Jeremiah Whitmore has achieved remarkable productivity at his plantation, but his methods are beyond anything I have witnessed in my 30 years of plantation management. He has developed what he calls scientific approaches to slave discipline that involve psychological manipulation as much as physical punishment. His Negroes work with an efficiency born of absolute terror, but I fear he has created something monstrous in his pursuit of perfection. Dr. Rodriguez had also discovered records from Dr. Elias Thornton, a physician who had been called to treat enslaved people at the Whitmore plantation on multiple occasions. His private journal, preserved in the Thornton family papers, contained entries that were difficult to read without feeling physically ill. February 15, 1851. Called again to the Whitmore plantation to treat 3 Negroes who had been subjected to Mr. Whitmore's latest disciplinary innovation. The injuries were unlike anything I have seen, clearly the result of prolonged, systematic torture designed to maximize pain while keeping the subjects alive and capable of work. I have urged Mr. Whitmore to moderate his methods, but he insists that his techniques are necessary for maintaining order and productivity. March 3, 1851. Another visit to Whitmore's plantation. Found 2 Negroes dead and several others in conditions that suggest they will not survive the week. When I questioned Mr. Whitmore about the deaths, he showed me detailed records he keeps of his experiments in slave management. He speaks of human beings as if they were laboratory animals, documenting their responses to various forms of physical and psychological pressure. I fear that this man has lost all sense of humanity in his pursuit of what he calls optimal labor extraction. Boom. But it was not just the systematic physical abuse that made the Whitmore plantation unique. It was Jeremiah Whitmore's belief that he could break the human spirit so completely that his enslaved workers would become perfectly obedient automatons. He had developed what he called psychological conditioning techniques that involved separating families, creating artificial hierarchies among the enslaved population, and using a combination of rewards and punishments to create complete dependency on his approval. Dr. Rodriguez had found evidence of these techniques in Whitmore's own writings, preserved in a collection of papers that had been donated to the University of Georgia by a family member in the 1960s. Whitmore had kept detailed journals documenting his methods, writing about enslaved people as if they were subjects in a scientific experiment. November 12, 1850. Separated the woman Sarah from her children today and assigned her to work in the fields while placing the children in the house under the supervision of other slaves. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Sarah's productivity increased by approximately 30%, and her compliance with orders became absolute. The children, meanwhile, have become model servants, apparently understanding that their mother's welfare depends on their behavior. December 8, 1850. Implemented the new reward system today. Selected 3 slaves who have shown exceptional obedience and provided them with better food, clothing, and living conditions. The effect on the other slaves has been remarkable. They now compete with each other for my approval, reporting on each other's behavior and working to exceed my expectations. I have successfully turned them against each other, eliminating the possibility of coordinated resistance. These psychological manipulation techniques, combined with physical brutality, had created an atmosphere of terror and despair that permeated every aspect of life on the Whitmore plantation. But Jeremiah Whitmore's greatest innovation was what he called his disposal system, a method for eliminating enslaved people who became too sick, too old, or too psychologically damaged to be productive, while using their deaths as examples to terrorize the remaining population. Dr. Rodriguez had discovered evidence of this system in the most disturbing documents she had ever encountered in her research. Hidden in the basement of the Whitmore family's former law office, she had found a ledger that Jeremiah Whitmore had used to track what he euphemistically called inventory reduction. The ledger contained detailed records of the deaths of enslaved people on the plantation, including dates, causes of death, and notes about the educational value of each death for the remaining population. The entries in the ledger revealed the systematic nature of the killings. January 15th, 1852, disposed of the old man Moses today. Age and infirmity had made him unproductive, and his influence on the younger slaves was becoming problematic. Used the new method, slow strangulation, in front of the assembled population. The psychological impact was significant. Productivity increased by 15% in the following week. March 22nd, 1852. Eliminated the woman Ruth, who had been showing signs of mental instability since the separation from her children. Her condition was affecting the morale of other slaves. Used the drowning method in the plantation pond. Made sure all slaves witnessed the event. The lesson was well received. July 4th, 1852. Disposed of 3 slaves today, 2 men who had been caught attempting to communicate with slaves from neighboring plantations, and 1 woman who had been caught teaching other slaves to read. Used the hanging method for maximum visibility and impact. The Independence Day timing was intentional, wanted to emphasize that freedom is not for their kind. By Dr. Rodriguez's calculations, based on the ledger entries and other documentation, at least 150 enslaved people had died on the Whitmore plantation between 1847 and 1863, when Jeremiah Whitmore himself died under mysterious circumstances. Many of these deaths were clearly murders, disguised as accidents or attributed to natural causes in official records. But the most disturbing aspect of Dr. Rodriguez's research was what she had discovered about the final years of Jeremiah Whitmore's life. Beginning in 1860, his journal entries began to describe strange occurrences on the plantation, unexplained sounds, objects moving on their own, and what he described as manifestations of dead slaves. October 31st, 1860. The disturbances continued to increase in frequency and intensity. Last night, I was awakened by the sound of chains dragging across the floor of my bedroom, but when I lit a lamp, nothing was there. The slaves claim to see figures in the fields at night, figures they recognize as people who have died on the plantation. I have dismissed these claims as superstition, but I cannot explain what I myself have witnessed. December 15th, 1860. The manifestations are becoming more aggressive. Yesterday, I found my office in complete disarray, with papers scattered and furniture overturned. The slaves insist they saw the spirit of the woman Ruth, whom I disposed of in 1852, standing in the doorway. I'm beginning to wonder if my methods have had unintended consequences. February 28th, 1861. I can no longer deny what is happening in this house. The dead slaves are returning, and they are angry. I see them in the corners of my vision, hear their voices in the wind, feel their presence in every room. They seem to be waiting for something or someone. I fear that my innovations in slave management may have created something beyond my control. The journal entries from Whitmore's final years painted a picture of a man slowly losing his sanity as he was confronted by the consequences of his actions. The psychological techniques he had used to break the spirits of enslaved people seemed to have backfired, creating a supernatural backlash that he was powerless to control. Jeremiah Whitmore's death in 1863 was officially attributed to a heart attack, but Dr. Rodriguez had found evidence suggesting a very different cause. A letter from Dr. Thornton to a colleague, discovered in the physician's papers, described the scene he had found when called to examine Whitmore's body. I have never seen anything like the condition in which I found Jeremiah Whitmore. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. His body was covered in scratches and bruises that could not be explained by a heart attack, and the room in which he died showed signs of a violent struggle. Most disturbing of all, the slaves on the plantation claimed to have heard voices, multiple voices, in Whitmore's room throughout the night before his death. They insisted that the voices belonged to people who had died on the plantation years earlier. After Jeremiah Whitmore's death, the plantation was inherited by his son, Marcus Whitmore, who attempted to continue operating the property. But according to the historical records Dr. Rodriguez had found, Marcus lasted less than 6 months before abandoning the plantation and fleeing to Europe. His letters to family members described experiences that were even more intense than those his father had documented. The house is no longer habitable. The spirits of the dead slaves have taken control, and they are seeking revenge for the horrors inflicted upon them. I see them everywhere, in the mirrors, in the shadows, standing at the foot of my bed. They speak to me in voices filled with rage and pain, demanding justice for the crimes committed against them. I cannot stay here any longer. The plantation remained abandoned from 1863 until 1875, when it was purchased by a northern investor who planned to convert it into a hotel. But the investor's plans were quickly abandoned after a series of incidents that were documented in local newspapers. Workers reported tools moving on their own, unexplained sounds throughout the building, and apparitions of enslaved people who seemed to be reenacting the tortures they had suffered. Dr. Rodriguez had spent months researching the subsequent history of the property, and the pattern was always the same. Anyone who attempted to occupy or renovate the mansion was driven away by supernatural phenomena that seemed to be connected to the enslaved people who had died there. The spirits, according to numerous witness accounts, were not random hauntings, but organized manifestations with a clear purpose: to ensure that the crimes committed on the plantation were never forgotten and that those responsible were held accountable. As Dr. Rodriguez stood before the mansion on that October evening. She understood that she was not just investigating a haunted house. She was confronting the unresolved trauma of 150 people who had been systematically tortured and murdered, whose stories had been erased from official history, and whose spirits refused to rest until justice was served. The investigation she was about to begin would challenge everything she thought she knew about the paranormal and force her to confront the darkest chapters of American history. But she also sensed that the spirits in the mansion were not just seeking revenge. They were seeking recognition, acknowledgement of their humanity, and a voice to tell their stories to a world that had tried to forget them. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's first night in the Whitmore Mansion began at sunset on October 15, 2023. As she set up her equipment in what had once been Jeremiah Whitmore's study, she could feel the weight of history pressing down on her like a physical force. The room still contained much of the original furniture, a massive mahogany desk, leather-bound chairs, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that held volumes on agriculture, medicine, and what Whitmore had euphemistically called labor management. Her equipment array was more sophisticated than anything she had used in previous investigations: electromagnetic field detectors, full-spectrum cameras, digital audio recorders, thermal imaging devices, and motion sensors. But as she calibrated the devices, she began to notice anomalies that suggested the mansion's supernatural activity was unlike anything she had encountered before. The electromagnetic readings were off the charts, but in patterns that seemed almost organized, as if multiple sources of energy were coordinating their activities. The temperature variations throughout the house followed no logical pattern based on the building's structure or ventilation, with some rooms maintaining temperatures that were 20 degrees colder than others, despite identical conditions. Most disturbing of all, her audio equipment was picking up sounds that seemed to be just below the threshold of human hearing. Whispers, footsteps, and what sounded like chains dragging across wooden floors. Dr. Rodriguez had barely finished setting up her equipment when the first manifestation occurred. At exactly 9:17 p.m., every electromagnetic detector in the house began registering massive spikes simultaneously. The temperature in Whitmore's study dropped 15 degrees in less than 30 seconds, and her breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. Then she heard the voice. It was a woman's voice, speaking in what sounded like a mixture of English and Gula, the Creole language spoken by enslaved people in the Georgia coastal region. The voice was clear enough to be understood, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not through the air, but directly into Dr. Rodriguez's consciousness. "You come to listen," the voice said. "You come to hear what they tried to silence. We've been waiting. We've been waiting so long for someone to listen." Dr. Rodriguez's training had taught her to remain calm during paranormal encounters, but this was different from anything she had experienced. The voice carried with it an emotional weight that was almost overwhelming, centuries of pain, anger, and desperate hope compressed into a few simple words. "I'm here to listen," Dr. Rodriguez said aloud, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I want to hear your story. I want to help people understand what happened here." The response was immediate and powerful. The electromagnetic readings spiked even higher, and Dr. Rodriguez's thermal imaging camera began showing multiple heat signatures throughout the room. Human-shaped forms that appeared and disappeared like flickering candles. "My name was Sarah," the voice continued, "and Dr. Rodriguez realized with a chill that this was the same Sarah mentioned in Jeremiah Whitmore's journal, the woman whose children had been taken from her as part of his psychological conditioning experiments. "I was born free in Charleston, had a husband, had children, had a life. Then the slave catchers came, sold me to the monster who built this house." As Sarah spoke, Dr. Rodriguez's equipment began registering additional presences. Her motion sensors detected movement throughout the mansion. Her audio recorders picked up multiple voices speaking in overlapping conversations, and her cameras captured shadowy figures moving through rooms that should have been empty. "We all hear," Sarah's voice explained. "All 150 of us who died in this place. We bound here by the pain, by the injustice, by the need for someone to know our names and remember our stories. The monster thought he could break us, thought he could make us disappear. But death didn't silence us, it gave us power." Dr. Rodriguez began to understand that she was not dealing with a traditional haunting, but with something far more complex and organized. The spirits in the mansion had maintained their individual identities and memories, and they had apparently been working together for over 160 years to ensure that their stories would eventually be told. "Tell me about the others," Dr. Rodriguez said, adjusting her recording equipment to capture as much as possible. "Tell me their names, their stories. Help me understand what Jeremiah Whitmore did to you." The response was overwhelming. Suddenly, the mansion filled with voices, men, women, and children, speaking in a chorus of pain and memory that threatened to drown out individual words. Dr. Rodriguez's audio equipment registered dozens of distinct voices, all speaking simultaneously but somehow remaining comprehensible. "My name was Moses," said an elderly male voice. "Worked these fields for 15 years before the monster decided I was too old to be useful. He strangled me with his own hands while the others watched. Said it was a lesson about the value of productivity." "I was Ruth," said another woman's voice, filled with a sadness that seemed to permeate the very air. "I taught the children to read in secret, tried to give them hope for a better future. When the monster found out, he drowned me in the pond behind the house, made all the children watch so they would know what happened to those who tried to learn." "My name was Samuel," said a young man's voice. "I tried to escape, tried to reach my family in South Carolina. The monster caught me and used me as an example, hung me from the oak tree in the front yard and left my body there for 3 days so everyone could see what happened to those who sought freedom." The voices continued, each spirit sharing their name, their story, and the circumstances of their death. Dr. Rodriguez realized that she was witnessing something unprecedented in paranormal research, a collective testimony from the victims of systematic murder, preserved beyond death and waiting for someone who would listen and believe. But as the night progressed, Dr. Rodriguez began to understand that the spirits were not just sharing their stories, they were also showing her what had happened. Her thermal imaging camera began registering heat signatures that seemed to be reenacting scenes from the plantation's history. She watched in horror as ghostly figures appeared to be working in fields that no longer existed, being beaten by overseers who had been dead for over a century, and dying in ways that matched the descriptions in Jeremiah Whitmore's ledger. "You see now," Sarah's voice said, as Dr. Rodriguez watched a thermal image of a woman being separated from her children. "You see what the monster did to us. But that's not the worst part. The worst part was how he tried to make us forget who we were, tried to break our spirits so completely that we would become the animals he believed us to be." Dr. Rodriguez's equipment began registering a new type of activity. The electromagnetic readings shifted into patterns that seemed almost like brain waves, and she realized that the spirits were somehow sharing their memories directly with her. She began to experience flashes of sensation and emotion that were not her own. The feeling of chains around her ankles, the taste of meager rations, the terror of watching loved ones disappear in the night. "He had a system," Moses's voice explained. "Everything was planned. Everything was designed to break us down piece by piece. He would separate families, turn us against each other, reward some while punishing others for the same behavior. He studied us like we were insects, wrote down our reactions to his tortures like he was conducting scientific experiments. The children suffered the most," Ruth's voice added, and Dr. Rodriguez felt a wave of maternal anguish that was so intense it brought tears to her eyes. He would take them from their mothers when they were still babies, raise them to believe that slavery was natural, that they deserved nothing better. Some of the children grew up not even knowing their own names, calling themselves by the numbers he assigned them. As the night continued, Dr. Rodriguez began to understand the full scope of Jeremiah Whitmore's crimes. The spirits shared memories of psychological torture that was as devastating as the physical abuse. Enslaved people forced to watch their family members being killed, children trained to inform on their parents, individuals isolated and manipulated until they lost all sense of identity and self-worth. "But we remembered," Sarah's voice said with fierce pride. "Even when he tried to make us forget, we remembered who we were, where we came from, what we had lost. We told stories in secret, passed down names and histories, kept our humanity alive even when he tried to destroy it." Dr. Rodriguez's equipment began registering what appeared to be a massive, coordinated manifestation. Every device in the mansion showed maximum readings simultaneously, and the temperature throughout the building plummeted to near freezing levels. The spirits were preparing to show her something significant. "The monster thought he was so clever," Samuel's voice said with bitter satisfaction. "Thought his psychological methods made him superior to other plantation owners. But he made one mistake. He underestimated our capacity for memory and our desire for justice." Suddenly, Dr. Rodriguez's thermal imaging camera began showing a heat signature in Jeremiah Whitmore's bedroom, a signature that matched the size and shape of a human figure. But this figure was different from the others she had been observing. While the spirits of the enslaved people appeared as warm, bright images, this figure appeared cold and dark, as if it were absorbing heat rather than generating it. "That's him," Ruth's voice said with unmistakable hatred. "That's the monster. He's still here, trapped just like we are. But while we chose to stay to tell our stories, he can't leave. The weight of his crimes holds him here, and our presence torments him, just as his actions tormented us." Dr. Rodriguez realized that Jeremiah Whitmore's spirit was also bound to the mansion. But unlike the enslaved people who had maintained their dignity and humanity in death, Whitmore existed in a state of perpetual torment. The very people he had tried to break in life had become his jailers in death. "Every night he relives what he did to us," Moses explained. "But now he experiences it from our perspective. He feels every blow he struck, every family he separated, every life he destroyed. The psychological techniques he used on us have been turned against him, and he cannot escape the consequences of his actions." As dawn approached, the intensity of the manifestations began to decrease. But the spirits had one final message for Dr. Rodriguez. "You came here to investigate a haunting," Sarah's voice said, "but what you found is something different. We are not haunting this place. We are guarding it. We are making sure that the truth about what happened here is never forgotten, that the monster's crimes are never erased from history. Our stories must be told," Ruth added, "not just as ghost stories or tales of supernatural revenge, but as testimony to the resilience of the human spirit and the ultimate futility of trying to destroy someone's humanity. The world needs to know our names," Samuel concluded. "We were not just property, not just statistics in a ledger. We were human beings with hopes and dreams and families. We loved and laughed and cried and fought for our dignity, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty." As the sun rose over Savannah, Dr. Rodriguez sat in Jeremiah Whitmore's study, surrounded by hours of recorded testimony from 150 people who had been murdered over 160 years ago, but whose voices remained as clear and powerful as if they were standing beside her. She understood that her investigation had become something far more important than a paranormal research project. It had become a mission to ensure that these voices were finally heard and their stories finally told. The spirits of the Whitmore Mansion had waited over a century for someone to listen to their testimony. Now, through Dr. Rodriguez, they would finally have their day in court. Not a legal court, but the court of public opinion and historical memory. Their haunting was not a cry for help, but a demand for justice, and Dr. Rodriguez was determined to ensure that justice was finally served. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's second night in the Whitmore Mansion began with a revelation that changed everything she thought she understood about the supernatural phenomena she was investigating. As she reviewed the audio and video recordings from her first night, she discovered something that sent chills down her spine. The spirits were not just sharing their stories randomly, they were building a case. The testimonies she had recorded were organized chronologically and thematically, as if the 150 spirits had spent the past 160 years preparing for this moment. Each voice had provided specific details about dates, locations, and methods of torture and murder. The spirits had maintained perfect recall of events, conversations, and even the exact words Jeremiah Whitmore had used when describing his experiments to visitors. More importantly, the spirits had been collecting evidence. As Dr. Rodriguez explored the mansion during daylight hours, guided by whispered directions from voices only she could hear, she discovered hidden compartments and secret rooms that contained physical proof of Whitmore's crimes, documents, photographs, and artifacts that had been preserved by supernatural means for over a century. "We knew someone would come eventually," Sarah's voice explained, as Dr. Rodriguez uncovered a hidden panel in the study wall. "Someone who would listen, someone who would believe, someone who would help us get justice. We've been preparing for this day since the monster died." Behind the panel, Dr. Rodriguez found a collection of documents that should have decayed long ago, but remained in perfect condition. There were additional pages from Whitmore's journal, detailed records of his psychological conditioning experiments, and most damning of all, a series of photographs that Whitmore had commissioned to document his methods. The photographs were horrifying beyond description. They showed enslaved people in various stages of torture and psychological breakdown, with detailed notes on the back describing the scientific value of each image. Whitmore had apparently hired a photographer from Atlanta to create a visual record of his techniques, intending to publish a book on advanced slave management methods. "He was proud of what he did to us," Moses's voice said with bitter anger as Dr. Rodriguez examined the photographs. "Thought he was a genius, thought he was advancing the science of human control. He wanted the whole world to know about his innovations in breaking the human spirit." But the spirits had also preserved evidence of their resistance. Hidden in various locations throughout the mansion, Dr. Rodriguez found artifacts that told a very different story than the one in Whitmore's records. There were crude maps showing escape routes, hidden messages written in code, and small personal items that the enslaved people had managed to keep despite Whitmore's attempts to strip them of all possessions and identity. "We never stopped fighting," Ruth's voice explained as Dr. Rodriguez discovered a collection of small carved figures hidden in the walls. "Even when he thought he had broken us completely, we found ways to resist. We kept our names, our stories, our connections to each other. We planned escapes. We protected the children. We maintained our humanity no matter what he did to us." As the second night progressed, Dr. Rodriguez began to understand that the spirits had a specific plan for the evidence they had preserved. They wanted her to expose not just Jeremiah Whitmore's crimes, but the entire system that had enabled and protected him. The documents they had saved included correspondence with other plantation owners, government officials, and business leaders who had supported and profited from Whitmore's methods. "The monster didn't work alone," Samuel's voice revealed, as Dr. Rodriguez found letters from prominent Georgia politicians praising Whitmore's innovations in slave management. He had supporters, people who helped him, people who knew what he was doing and encouraged him to continue. They all guilty, and they all need to be exposed. The correspondence revealed a network of complicity that extended far beyond the Whitmore plantation. Government officials had provided legal protection for Whitmore's activities. Business leaders had invested in his operations, and other plantation owners had visited to learn his techniques. The entire Georgia elite had been aware of and supportive of systematic torture and murder, But the spirit's plan for justice extended beyond simply exposing historical crimes. As the night continued, Dr. Rodriguez began to experience visions that showed her the descendants of Whitmore's collaborators, people who had inherited wealth and power built on the suffering of enslaved people and who continued to benefit from that legacy. Justice isn't just about the past, Sarah's voice explained, as Dr. Rodriguez saw images of modern-day Georgia, showing her prominent families, businesses, and institutions that trace their origins to the antebellum period. It's about making sure that the people who profited from our suffering don't continue to profit from our silence. The spirits revealed that they had been monitoring the descendants of everyone involved in the Whitmore plantation's operations. They knew which families had built their fortunes on slave labor, which businesses had been founded with profits from human trafficking, and which institutions had been established to perpetuate the systems that had enabled their suffering. "We've been watching, we've been waiting, we've been planning," Moses's voice said with grim satisfaction. "Every family that got rich from our blood, every business that was built on our bones, every institution that was founded to keep our people down. We know about all of them, and now it's time for them to face the consequences." Dr. Rodriguez realized that the spirits were not just seeking historical acknowledgement, they were demanding contemporary accountability. They wanted the modern beneficiaries of slavery to acknowledge their inherited responsibility and to make amends for the crimes that had funded their prosperity. As the night reached its peak, the supernatural activity in the mansion intensified beyond anything Dr. Rodriguez had experienced. Every piece of equipment she had brought registered maximum readings simultaneously, and the temperature throughout the building dropped to levels that should have been impossible given the Georgia climate. But this time, the manifestations were not just auditory and thermal. Dr. Rodriguez began to see the spirits with her naked eyes, 150 figures standing throughout the mansion, no longer hidden in shadows or visible only through specialized equipment. They appeared as they had in life, wearing the simple clothes of enslaved people, but radiating a dignity and power that transcended their humble appearance. "You see us now as we really are," Ruth's voice said, as Dr. Rodriguez looked into the faces of men, women, and children who had been dead for over 160 years, but whose humanity blazed with undimmed intensity. Not as the broken victims the monster tried to create, but as the strong, proud people we always were. The spirits began to move through the mansion in a coordinated procession, and Dr. Rodriguez understood that she was witnessing something unprecedented, a supernatural demonstration of unity and purpose that defied every assumption about how hauntings were supposed to work. "We're not here to scare people," Samuel explained, as the procession moved through rooms where he and others had suffered and died. "We're here to educate people, to make sure our stories are told, to demand that justice finally be served." As the procession reached Jeremiah Whitmore's bedroom, Dr. Rodriguez saw something that made her blood run cold. In the center of the room stood a figure that was clearly Whitmore himself, but he appeared nothing like the confident plantation owner described in historical records. Instead, he appeared as a broken, terrified man, cowering before the spirits of the people he had tortured and killed. "Every night, he relives what he did to us," Sarah explained as Dr. Rodriguez watched Whitmore's spirit experience what appeared to be every moment of suffering he had inflicted on others. But he experiences it from our perspective, feeling every blow, every separation, every moment of despair. The psychological techniques he used to break us have been turned against him, and he cannot escape. The spirits explained that Whitmore's torment was not random cruelty, but precise justice. Just as he had systematically destroyed the psychological well-being of enslaved people, his own psychological state was being systematically dismantled by the very people he had victimized. He thought he was so clever, so scientific in his approach to breaking human beings, Moses said with grim satisfaction. Now he gets to experience the results of his science from the other side. He gets to feel what it's like to be stripped of dignity, to be treated as less than human, to have your spirit slowly destroyed by someone who has complete power over you. But the spirits made it clear that Whitmore's suffering was not their primary concern. They were focused on ensuring that his crimes were exposed and that the systems that had enabled him were finally held accountable. "The monster is getting what he deserves," Ruth said, "but that's not enough. We need the world to know what happened here. We need the people who profited from our suffering to acknowledge their debt, and we need to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again." As dawn approached, the spirits began to fade from Dr. Rodriguez's vision, but their message remained crystal clear. They had chosen her as their advocate, their voice in the world of the living, and they expected her to use the evidence they had preserved to demand justice, not just for historical crimes, but for their ongoing consequences. "You have everything you need now," Sarah's voice said as the first rays of sunlight entered the mansion. "You have our testimonies. You have the monster's own records. You have proof of who helped him and who profited from his crimes. Now you must decide what you're going to do with this knowledge." "The world has ignored our voices for 160 years, Samuel added. "They've tried to erase our stories, to pretend that what happened here was just part of the normal operations of slavery. But we know better, and now you know better too. Our haunting of this place was never about revenge," Moses concluded. "It was about preservation, preserving our stories, preserving the evidence, preserving the truth until someone came who could help us share it with the world." As Dr. Rodriguez packed her equipment and prepared to leave the mansion, she understood that her investigation had become something far more significant than a paranormal research project. She had been entrusted with the testimonies of 150 people who had been systematically tortured and murdered, and who had spent over a century waiting for someone to help them achieve justice. The spirits of the Whitmore Mansion had not been haunting the living. They had been preparing for this moment when their voices could finally be heard and their stories could finally be told. Dr. Rodriguez now carried the responsibility of ensuring that their wait had not been in vain and that the justice they sought would finally be served. The reckoning they had been planning for 160 years was about to begin, and Dr. Rodriguez would be their instrument of justice in the world of the living. 6 months after her investigation at the Whitmore Mansion, Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Georgia, preparing to present findings that would fundamentally change how America understood its history of slavery and its ongoing consequences. The evidence she had gathered from the spirits of 150 murdered enslaved people had led to the most comprehensive investigation of antebellum plantation crimes in American history. The presentation, titled "Voices from the Grave: The Whitmore Plantation Massacre and the Network of Complicity," had drawn historians, legal scholars, civil rights activists, and descendants of both enslaved people and plantation owners from across the country. But Dr. Rodriguez knew that her most important audience was not in the auditorium. It was the spirits who had entrusted her with their stories and who were counting on her to deliver the justice they had been seeking for over 160 years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Rodriguez began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "What I'm about to share with you is not just a ghost story or a tale of supernatural revenge. It is the testimony of 150 people who were systematically tortured and murdered between 1847 and 1863, and who have spent the past 160 years preserving evidence of their suffering and the network of complicity that enabled it." The presentation began with audio recordings from her investigation, the clear, articulate voices of Sarah, Moses, Ruth, Samuel, and dozens of others sharing their names, their stories, and the circumstances of their deaths. The audience sat in stunned silence as they heard first-hand accounts of psychological torture, systematic murder, and human experimentation that had been erased from official historical records. These voices, Dr. Rodriguez explained, represent the most detailed and comprehensive testimony we have ever received about the day-to-day operations of a plantation that specialized in what its owner called advanced slave management techniques. But more importantly, they represent the preserved memories and experiences of people whose humanity was denied in life, but who maintained their dignity and identity even in death. The physical evidence that the spirits had preserved was even more damning than their testimonies. Dr. Rodriguez displayed photographs, documents, and artifacts that provided irrefutable proof of Jeremiah Whitmore's crimes and the network of support that had enabled them. The audience gasped as they saw Whitmore's own photographs documenting his torture methods, his detailed records of psychological experiments, and his correspondence with government officials and business leaders who had encouraged and profited from his activities. What we see here, Dr. Rodriguez continued, is not the isolated actions of one cruel individual, but evidence of a systematic network of complicity that extended throughout Georgia's political and economic elite. Jeremiah Whitmore was not an aberration. He was the logical extreme of a system that treated human beings as property and that rewarded innovation in human exploitation. The investigation that had followed Dr. Rodriguez's initial findings had involved teams of historians, genealogists, and legal researchers who had traced the connections between the Whitmore plantation and the broader Georgia economy. What they had discovered was a web of complicity that included some of the most prominent families and institutions in the state. Dr. Rodriguez presented evidence showing that profits from the Whitmore plantation had been used to fund the establishment of banks, universities, and businesses that continued to operate in modern-day Georgia. She revealed that several prominent Georgia families had built their fortunes on investments in Whitmore's operations, and that some of the state's most respected institutions had been founded with money earned through systematic torture and murder. The spirits of the Whitmore Mansion have preserved this evidence for 160 years. Dr. Rodriguez explained, not out of a desire for revenge, but out of a determination to ensure that the truth would eventually be revealed and that those who profited from their suffering would be held accountable. The response to Dr. Rodriguez's presentation was immediate and dramatic. Within hours, news of the Whitmore Mansion investigation was being covered by media outlets across the country and around the world. The audio recordings of the spirits' testimonies went viral on social media, with millions of people sharing the voices of enslaved people speaking from beyond the grave about their experiences. But the real impact came from the legal and financial consequences that followed. Armed with the evidence preserved by the spirits, civil rights organizations filed lawsuits against institutions and families that had profited from the Whitmore plantation's operations. The lawsuits demanded not just acknowledgement of historical crimes, but concrete reparations for the descendants of enslaved people. The University of Georgia, which had received its original endowment from profits that included money from the Whitmore plantation, announced a comprehensive reparations program that included full scholarships for descendants of enslaved people, the establishment of a research center dedicated to studying slavery's ongoing impacts, and a memorial to the victims of plantation violence. Several major Georgia banks that had been founded with investments from plantation profits announced similar programs, including low-interest loans for Black-owned businesses, funding for affordable housing in historically Black communities, and support for educational initiatives focused on African American history and culture. But perhaps the most significant response came from the descendants of the families who had been directly involved in the Whitmore plantation's operations. Margaret Whitmore Chen, the current owner of the mansion, announced that she was donating the property to be converted into a memorial and museum dedicated to the 150 people who had died there. "I cannot undo the crimes committed by my ancestor," Margaret said in a statement that was read at the presentation, "but I can ensure that the voices of his victims are finally heard and that their stories are preserved for future generations." The Whitmore Mansion will become a place of education and remembrance, not a monument to the man who built it, but a memorial to the people he destroyed. Other descendants of plantation owners and their collaborators followed Margaret's example. The Morrison family, whose ancestor had corresponded with Jeremiah Whitmore about his methods, established a foundation dedicated to supporting historically black colleges and universities. The Thornton family, descended from the physician who had documented but failed to stop Whitmore's crimes, funded a medical scholarship program for students from underserved communities. Dr. Rodriguez had also worked with the spirits to identify the descendants of the 150 people who had died at the plantation. Using genealogical research combined with information provided by the spirits themselves, she had been able to trace family lines and connect modern-day individuals with their ancestors who had suffered and died at Whitmore's hands. The reunion between the living descendants and the spirits of their ancestors became one of the most moving aspects of the entire investigation. Dr. Rodriguez organized sessions at the mansion where family members could hear the voices of their enslaved ancestors, learn their stories, and understand the circumstances of their deaths. "It was like finally meeting family members I had never known existed," said James Washington, a descendant of one of the enslaved people who had died at the plantation. "My great-great-grandmother Sarah had been sold away from her family when she was young, and we had never known what happened to her. To hear her voice, to learn her story, to understand how she maintained her dignity and humanity even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, it was both heartbreaking and inspiring." The spirits themselves seemed to find peace in finally having their stories told and their descendants acknowledged. As the months passed, the supernatural activity at the mansion began to change. The voices became less urgent, the manifestations less intense, and the overall atmosphere shifted from one of desperate need for justice to one of quiet satisfaction. "We've been waiting so long for this day," Sarah's voice told Dr. Rodriguez during one of her final visits to the mansion. "Waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to believe, waiting for someone to help us get justice. Now our stories are being told, our names are being remembered, and the people who profited from our suffering are being held accountable. The monster still here," Moses added, referring to Jeremiah Whitmore's spirit, "and he's still suffering like he made us suffer. But that's not what matters most to us anymore. What matters is that our voices have been heard and our humanity has been recognized." The transformation of the Whitmore Mansion into a memorial and museum became a model for how other sites of historical trauma could be addressed. The museum featured not just exhibits about the crimes committed there, but also celebrations of the lives, cultures, and resistance of the enslaved people who had suffered there. Visitors to the museum could hear the recorded testimonies of the spirits, see the evidence they had preserved, and learn about the ongoing impacts of slavery on American society. But they could also learn about the strength, resilience, and humanity of people who had maintained their dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. "This place was designed to break the human spirit," Ruth's voice explained in a recording that played for museum visitors. "But we never let it break us. We kept our names, our stories, our connections to each other. We loved and laughed and hoped and fought for our freedom. We were not victims. We were human beings who refused to be destroyed." The success of the Whitmore Mansion investigation inspired similar projects at other sites of historical trauma. Paranormal investigators, historians, and civil rights activists began working together to uncover suppressed stories of slavery, genocide, and other forms of systematic oppression. Dr. Rodriguez established the Institute for Historical Justice, which used both traditional research methods and paranormal investigation techniques to uncover and preserve the stories of people whose voices had been silenced by history. The Institute's work led to the discovery of mass graves at former plantation sites, the identification of previously unknown networks of complicity in the slave trade, and the recovery of testimonies from people whose stories had been deliberately erased. What we learned at the Whitmore Mansion, Dr. Rodriguez explained in her final report on the investigation, is that the dead do not always rest peacefully when justice has been denied. But we also learned that the spirits of the oppressed are not seeking revenge. They are seeking recognition, acknowledgement, and the kind of justice that can only come from truth-telling and accountability. The spirits of the Whitmore Mansion had achieved something unprecedented in the annals of both paranormal research and civil rights activism. They had used their supernatural abilities not to terrorize the living, but to preserve evidence, maintain testimonies, and ultimately secure justice for crimes that had been committed over 160 years earlier. As Dr. Rodriguez concluded her final visit to the mansion, now transformed into a place of education and remembrance, she could feel the presence of the spirits one last time. But their energy was different now. No longer desperate and urgent, but peaceful and satisfied. "Thank you," Sarah's voice whispered, barely audible but filled with profound gratitude. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing. Thank you for helping us finally get justice." The Whitmore Mansion was no longer haunted in the traditional sense. The spirits had found peace not through forgetting or moving on, but through having their stories told, their humanity acknowledged, and their suffering transformed into a force for education and positive change. Their haunting had become a healing. Their cries for justice had become a call for accountability, and their preservation of evidence had become a model for how the voices of the oppressed could transcend even death to demand recognition and reparations. The 150 spirits who had died at the Whitmore plantation had finally achieved the justice they had been seeking for over 160 years, and in doing so, they had shown the world that the fight for human dignity and accountability knows no boundaries, not even the boundary between life and death. The end important disclaimer: this story is completely fictional and was created exclusively for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, historical details, and supernatural occurrences are products of imagination and do not represent real people, living or deceased, nor actual historical events or locations. Any resemblance to reality is purely coincidental.